principal shipping agents, welcome to you, and other operators in that sea container supply and logistics chain. We're again using Teams Live, so it looks like you're on a TV format. You can hear or see someone speaking to you like this, or if we have the slides up, you'll see the slide and you'll hear their voices. The interaction from you, participants, it's really important, and the way you can interact is through that question and answer bubble that's in the top of your menu. It's got a question mark in it, and you can click on that. And during the session, during the speakers, please put your questions into there, and we'll get to those later on at the end in that question and answer session. Like I said, that'll be available all throughout the webinar itself. So please direct the question or the name of the person you want the question asked to. That just helps us make sure we get the right person to answer it. And also, don't worry if your exact question doesn't come up straight away. Sometimes we'll combine a few questions because sometimes they're similar, and we'll do that as best we can. And that way it makes it more efficient and we get through questions. We had well over 40 yesterday, so that was a really good and busy schedule you provided our speakers. If you need to leave early, like go to another meeting or go and look after kids or whatever you're doing, please share the link of this webinar to your stakeholders, to your colleagues, your friends, and they can have a look at it too. It's the Urgent Actions webpage. We know many of you have gone there before, so that's a really good resource for past sessions and also future information to come as well. You'll hear from 3 speakers today in Nathan Reid, Charlotte Garner and Sam Griffiths. They're all from the Compliance Partnerships section of that Australian Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. We'll start off with Nathan Reid, and he's going to talk about the CAPRA urgent actions. So over to you, please, Nathan. Lovely to hear from you.
Thanks, Jamie. Really appreciate that introduction. So I'm Nathan Reid. I'm a director within the Compliance and Enforcement Division of the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. My team has responsibility for our offshore treatment measures, and offshore treatment measures and treatments themselves are a critical control that Australia uses to manage the risks posed by Capra beetle. So as with Jamie, I'd like to thank you all for making time this afternoon, or whatever time it is in your country, to join us at this information session. Many of you may have heard some or all of these discussions previously at information sessions, but we're likely to have a range of new people at these sessions, so please bear with us as we get through some of the information about the CAPRA measures that Australia's implementing. So connecting with all of you, with our industry participants, is an extremely important element for us in managing the risks posed by Capra beetle. It's something that we at the Australian Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment cannot do alone. So we want to work in collaboration with overseas national plant protection organisations and also various industry sectors that have a role in this process. We understand that the measures Australia's already implemented and will implement in the future can require changes to industry practice and processes. So these changes need to be considered by a range of different industry participants and for a range of different reasons. And when I refer to industry participants, I'm talking about producers, manufacturers, exporters, shippers and treatment providers, with the latter being the focus of much of this information session. There are a range of acceptable treatments for Capra beetle. We spoke yesterday about methylbromide fumigation and also heat treatment. But today's presentation will be focusing on a new or provisional treatment that we're looking at for controlled atmospheres. So from my point of view, I've always said that the first step in complying with requirements or conditions is understanding them. And that's why these information sessions are so important to us. As Jamie mentioned, please use the chat function if you have any questions throughout the presentation. And we'll try and provide as much clarity about the measures that Australia's implemented and why. So as you'll see, there's a number of illustrations on this first slide. Let's keep Capra beetle out. So Australia doesn't have Capra beetle and we want to keep it that way. Capra beetle is Australia's #2 national priority plant pest and #1 plant pest for grains. It's a significant threat to the Australian plant industries, including grain exports. As a storage pest, Capra beetle destroys grain quality, making it unfit for human or animal consumption. Stored products may become contaminated with beetles, cast skins and hairs from larvae, which can be a human health risk also. And if Capra beetle enters Australia, it would have significant economic impacts on Australia. And they're in the magnitude of $15.5 million over 20 years through revenue losses arising from damaged grain in storage and exports. Now, Capra beetle itself, it's a cryptic pest. That makes it very difficult to detect because of its small size. And larvae can survive without food for over 12 months and are resistant to various treatments, making control potentially difficult and costly. As I said, we have 3 acceptable treatments at this present time. We often get asked questions about phosphine. Now, phosphine, there is widely known resistance for Capra beetle. So at this point in time, it's not part of these measures. But Australia's seen a significant increase in detections in 2020, including Capra beetle as a hitchhiking pest in sea containers. This treatment that we're talking about today, the controlled atmosphere, is not for containers. It is for products themselves. So Australia's taking a phased approach to implementing measures to guard against Capra beetle. The urgent actions have been broken into 6 phases. However, you may notice from the illustration on the screen that the phases have not been implemented in a sequential order. The reason for that is a change in the increased risk associated with sea containers. But if you look at the first phase was a ban on high-risk plant products within unaccompanied personal effects and low-value freight. And that was implemented in September 2020. The next phase was a ban on high-risk plant products within accompanied baggage or via the international traveller or mail pathway articles. And that was implemented in October 2020. Then, due to the increasing risk associated with Capra beetle as a hitchhiker pest on sea containers, we jumped to phase 6. And those new measures for sea containers were implemented on the 12th of April 2021. But the phase that we're talking about now is phase 3, which is revised phytosanitary certification and new offshore treatment requirements for high-risk plant products. And they'll be implemented on 30 September this year. So that date is fast approaching. And I'll now hand over to a colleague of mine who will talk more about the plant products. So I'll hand over to Charlotte Garner. Hi, Charlotte. We can't hear you there, Charlotte.
Got Nathan, and sorry about the technical difficulties. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charlotte Garner, and I work in the Compliance Partnership section at the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. Today, I'm going to give a summary of the high-risk plant products and an overview of the Capra Phase 3 requirements. Phase 3 high-risk plant products. From September 30, 2021, new import conditions will commence for high-risk plant products imported via commercial pathways. The new import conditions will apply to air freight and sea freight, including LCLs and FCL/FCX containers. Please note that the Phase 3 requirements are in addition to Phase 6A requirements. Phase 6A requires mandatory treatment requirements for target risk containers. Please see our website for more details. This slide demonstrates some images of the risk of Capra infestation in high-risk plant products. On the left, we have an image of Capra beetle adults, larvae, and cast skins in stored grade. And on the right, we have an image of Capra beetle larvae and adult Capra on seeds. The new Phase 3 requirements apply to high-risk plant products. This slide contains a list of the high-risk plant products, including rice, wheat, chickpeas, and other products listed on the screen. Please note, there are some exclusions to the high-risk plant products. The exclusion list was updated on August the 2nd with some notable changes. These changes include goods that are commercially processed to a powder, meal, or flake and packaged in bags less than or equal to 25 kilos. However, these goods will require a phytosanitary certificate. Other additions to the exclusion list include breakfast cereals and snack foods that are commercially prepared and retail packaged, bakery and bread mixes that are commercially prepared and retail packaged, bakery and bread mixes that are commercially prepared and packaged, and commercially prepared packaged herbal tea. The above exclusions may be determined through evidence provided on a product label or commercial documentation. Please note, this is only a summary of the excluded products. Please see our website for the full list of excluded products. This slide outlines the Kappa beetle target risk countries. Kappa Phase 3 has import requirements for Kappa beetle target risk countries and for all other countries importing high-risk plant products. Kappa beetle target risk countries require the goods to be treated offshore using an approved treatment option, including methyl bromide, heat, or controlled atmosphere treatment. Target risk countries also require the goods to be inspected by a government official, and this is to be documented on a phytosanitary certificate. Please note that if the goods are exported from a Kappa beetle target risk country and are packed into an FCL/FCX sea container, the sea container must also be treated. High-risk plant products exported from all other countries require the goods to be inspected by a government official, and this is also to be documented on a phytosanitary certificate. If the container is also required to be treated in addition to the goods, then this can be done simultaneously with methyl bromide. For heat and controlled atmosphere treatments, the goods and the container must be treated separately. There are 3 approved offshore treatment options for Phase 3: heat treatment, methyl bromide treatment, and controlled atmosphere treatment. If a treatment provider is conducting heat treatment, the department will accept treatments conducted by unregistered treatment providers. However, we encourage treatment providers to register their interest with us. The department also strongly encourages the use of providers approved under the Offshore Brown Marmorated Stink Bug Treatment Provider Scheme. If a treatment provider is conducting a methyl bromide treatment in an AFAS country, the department accepts those approved under the Australian Fumigation Accreditation Scheme, also known as AFAS. The department will accept treatments conducted by unregistered treatment providers in non-AFAS countries. However, again, the department strongly encourages the use of providers approved under the Offshore Brown Marmorated Stink Bug Treatment Provider Scheme. For controlled atmosphere treatment providers, the department is currently designing a scheme for those treatments, and we encourage companies to register their interest with us via email at offshoretreatments@awe.gov.au. I will now hand over to my colleague Sam Griffith, who will give a summary of the controlled atmosphere treatment requirements.
Thanks for that, Charlotte, and hello to everyone. For those that haven't met me before, my name's Sam Griffiths, and I'm an Assistant Director in the department's Compliance Partnerships section. Today I want to talk about controlled atmosphere treatments. and applying these treatments to meet Australia's Capra Beetle Phase 3 requirements. So importantly, as Charlotte touched on, controlled atmosphere treatments are being offered as a provisional measure to provide an alternative to the established treatment options that we have available to manage the risk of Capra Beetle. We know that methyl bromide is not available in every country. We also know that it's not suitable for some commodities. We know that heat treatment can be difficult to achieve for some commodities, and it can also be unsuitable and cause some damage to some commodities. So noting that, we're offering controlled atmosphere as an alternative to those established treatments. Now, it's important to note that if you would like to use a controlled atmosphere treatment to manage the risk of Capra Beetle and to comply with Australia's Capra requirements, this must be done using a valid import permit. So again, if you're an importer and you want to use the controlled atmosphere treatment, you must obtain an import permit from the department. And if you're a treatment provider and you're looking to conduct or someone engages you to conduct these treatments, I'd encourage you to ensure that they have a valid import permit from the department and that they have your treatment provider details listed correctly on that import permit. Importantly, all of the controlled atmosphere treatments must be conducted in accordance with Australia's requirements. And for some of these treatments, that means in accordance with our controlled atmosphere methodology. And I'll explain that a little bit further in the next slide. Again, as Charlotte mentioned, anyone out there that is interested in conducting a controlled atmosphere treatment, we'd encourage you to reach out to the department through that email and register your interest. As Charlotte said, there's sort of two reasons for doing that. One is we're designing the scheme for registering and approving controlled atmosphere treatment providers. And so we'd like to get your details so that you can be kept informed of the development of that scheme. But secondly, we'd also like to be able to provide feedback to you on your treatment setup, how you plan on conducting the treatments, so that we can proactively provide some advice on making sure that you are compliant with our requirements. It's really important to note that high-risk plant products must be treated within 21 days prior to export from a Capra country, and that failure to comply with any of our requirements will result in export or destruction of the consignment. So it's really, really important to make sure that these treatments are conducted correctly, that they're effective, and that they manage the risk of Capra Beetle. That'll enable the goods to be traded and sold within Australia and ensure that that trade continues to move between our countries. Thanks, Charlotte. If you want to flick to the next slide. So there are three controlled atmosphere treatment rates that the department is currently offering. So those are a high carbon dioxide atmosphere under altered pressure, and we'll get into the specific rates in a moment. High carbon dioxide atmospheric pressure and low oxygen treatments at atmospheric pressure. Now, it's important to note that the high carbon dioxide atmospheres conducted under high pressure, those must be conducted using only commercially available high pressure controlled atmosphere equipment. So specialist designed and commercially available high pressure setups. Backyard engineering jobs or trying to build a chamber that will meet these requirements will not be accepted for Australia's imports currently. We're looking for commercial systems that have their own application requirements. And so for those those carbon dioxide atmosphere treatments conducted under high pressure, those are outside of the scope of our methodology. Our controlled atmosphere methodology will only apply to those treatments being done at atmospheric pressure. So those second two options, the high carbon dioxide at atmospheric pressure and low oxygen at atmospheric pressure. And I think given the limited availability of commercial setups for those high pressure treatments, I think those atmospheric pressure treatments are likely to be the most common, particularly in the short term until some additional facilities are perhaps come online. So Charlotte, if you can flick to the next slide, we'll just go through exactly what the department's rates are for these treatments. So we'll start with that high carbon dioxide, that high pressure treatment. And you can see there what we're looking for is a carbon dioxide concentration of 95% or above at 20 degrees or above, and a pressure of 20 bar or above for a minimum of 5 hours. For those that are unfamiliar with bar and instead think in pounds per square inch or PSI, that's the equivalent to 290 PSI. The second rate for high pressure treatments is the treatment at 30 bar for 3 hours. And again, 30 bar is equivalent to 435 PSI. So these high pressure treatments you can see are pretty significant and would require specialist equipment to be able to conduct these treatments. And that's why we're only going to accept these treatments where they're conducted using commercially available equipment and not something that's sort of designed and been built on a one-off basis. The two treatments that I think are going to be the more common ones are the high carbon dioxide at atmospheric pressure. So this is a treatment with a CO2 concentration of 80% or above at 25 degrees Celsius or above at normal pressure for 28 consecutive days. And then the other option there is low oxygen at atmospheric pressure. And we have two rates for this particular option. So a concentration of 1% or less of oxygen at 25 degrees Celsius or above at normal atmospheric pressure for 22 consecutive days, or at 28 degrees Celsius for 12 consecutive days. Now, a couple of important things to note here. When we're talking about the temperature that these treatments are being conducted at, we are talking about the temperature of both the enclosure and the goods. So for that last oxygen treatment that I mentioned, 28 degrees for 12 consecutive days, that's 28 degrees within the enclosure and within the goods for the whole 12 days. If it goes below 28 degrees, then you cannot use that rate. If it goes below 25 degrees, you can't use either of the high carbon dioxide or the low oxygen rate. So it'll be important to make sure that there is some temperature control in the treatments that you're conducting. The second thing that's worth noting there is obviously the duration of these treatments. So leaving aside the high pressure options for a moment, the shortest treatment here is 12 consecutive days, and the longest treatment is 28 consecutive days. This is obviously going to create some disruptions for supply chains, and it's really important that treatment providers, exporters, importers all get together to work out exactly how these treatments are going to be conducted. It's worth noting that those 12 consecutive days, the exposure period only starts once the treatment has come up to the appropriate gas concentration. So it can actually take longer than the days listed there for these treatments to be conducted, because it can sometimes, depending on the size of the enclosure, it can take another 1 or 2 days to bring them to the correct concentration. The other thing that's unique or might be slightly different in Australia's requirements than what people might be used to is that the concentrations we are talking about here and the temperatures must be maintained throughout the exposure period. So I think there's common practice within industry at the moment, particularly in that carbon dioxide treatment, to start the treatment with 80% carbon dioxide, but then the concentration sort of decays over the duration of the exposure period. Australia, for these Capra beetle measures, because of how difficult Capra beetle are to manage and kill, particularly in the diapause phase, we require that concentration throughout the entire exposure period. And that may mean that some existing controlled atmosphere treatments or modified atmosphere treatment enclosures are not suitable for use with Australia's measures. So it's going to be really important that people have a look at those rates and have a look at their equipment to see whether or not they're capable of meeting those requirements. Thanks, Charlotte. The next thing to note, and I mentioned it earlier, is that if you're looking to use this controlled atmosphere treatment option to import goods to Australia, you need to apply for an import permit. So the importer looking to import these goods will need a valid import permit when the goods arrive. And the information that the department's looking for before we will issue a import permit is information on the treatment provider, which option is going to be used, some packaging and product information, and some information on post-treatment storage arrangements, just to ensure that the treatments are being conducted effectively and that there's no risk of the goods containing CAPRA. So again, if you're an importer and you're looking to use a controlled atmosphere treatment, you need to apply for an import permit for the department. And if you're a treatment provider that is going to be conducting these treatments, you'll need to, or I'd encourage you to ensure that the details captured on the import permit are accurate and that your treatment certificate details match what's on the treatment, the import permit. Thanks, Charlotte. If you can flick to the next slide. So importantly, like I said before, so leaving aside the high pressure treatment option, so the two options that are at normal atmospheric pressure are going to be subject to Australia's controlled atmosphere treatment methodology. And the requirements that I'm about to go through all come from the new methodology that we've developed. This methodology has been developed in consultation with experts and leading industry providers. And so the department's tried its best to capture a set of requirements that are practical, easy to understand, and will result in an effective treatment. To help us inform the development of this document, we currently have a consultation draft available on our website, and I'll put a link to that document in the chat in a moment. I'd encourage anyone that's interested in conducting this controlled atmosphere treatment to have a look at the consultation draft that we have out for our methodology and to provide comments back by the end of this week. Any comments that we get back, we will consider and we can update the requirements. So the requirements that I'm about to go through all come from that consultation draft. These are the requirements that we are considering at the moment. And unless we get specific feedback, these will be the requirements that controlled atmosphere treatments conducted for Australia must meet. Thanks, Charlotte. So first thing to note with a controlled atmosphere treatment, there are probably three different types of enclosures that you can use to conduct these treatments. So you can take you can create a sheeted enclosure or use sometimes referred to as a cocoon. These sheeted enclosures can be constructed around sea containers, or they can be constructed as sheeted stack treatments is often the common way that they're referred to within industry. It's important to note when creating a sheeted enclosure, whether it's a sheeted container or whether it's just sheets around goods, that it must be what we refer to as 6-side sheeted. So there must be a sheet placed on the ground as well as all the other sides around the enclosure. So we're really looking for a gas-tight enclosure created using sheets. So those of you that are familiar with methyl bromide treatments may not be familiar with putting a sheet down to create a sheeted enclosure. You might be conducting those treatments on the ground. For controlled atmosphere treatments, that's not allowed. You will need to put down a sheet between the goods and the ground to create a 6-sided sheeted enclosure. Your second option is to use what we call an unsheeted enclosure. The most common form of this is, of course, a sea container or a shipping container. So you can use a shipping container to conduct these treatments. You can also use a silo or silo bin, a bunker, or another sort of type of unsheeted enclosure, but as I said, containers are probably likely to be the most common form of treatment here. I want to stress here and clarify though that controlled atmosphere treatments that are performed using a container as an enclosure will not count as a treatment for that container. The container options only include methyl bromide, heat treatment, or insecticide using deltamethrin. So a controlled atmosphere treatment performed using the container as an enclosure will not count as the container being treated, but the container may be able to be used as an enclosure to help facilitate these treatments. And I can maybe explain that a little bit later if people have any questions. Your final option, and what is likely to be pretty common, I'd imagine, is a treatment chamber. And a chamber is a special or a purpose-built enclosure designed specifically to control atmosphere treatments. And these are likely to be the easiest enclosures when conducting a controlled atmosphere treatment. Thanks, Charlotte. Important to note that whichever type of enclosure that you choose, you will need to make sure that that enclosure has been pressure tested. And so for sheeted enclosures and unsheeted enclosures, the pressure test must be performed within 24 hours of the treatment. So within either the day of or the day before the treatment's conducted, and you can see the instructions there on how to conduct, or sorry, not the instructions, but the requirements for those treatments, all around measuring the half-life in terms of the pressure decay for those enclosures. Chambers, because they're purposefully built and specifically designed, they only require a pressure test every 6 months. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. But important to note, if you're not using a chamber, then your enclosure needs to be pressure tested within 24 hours of the treatment being conducted, and the pressure test needs to be conducted with everything set up ready for treatment. So the goods need to be in the enclosure, your monitoring devices need to be in the enclosure, your gas supply and outlet all needs to be set up as if the treatment was about to be performed. So for those sheeted and unsheeted enclosures, the easiest way to do your pressure test is to pressure test it right before you start to introduce your gas. For chambers, obviously you can do that every 6 months, but you're still required to make sure that that chamber is set up as if it was ready to be treated. Thanks, Charlotte. So the two types of gases that you can use to conduct these treatments, and it will depend on the type of treatment that you're performing. But if you're performing a carbon dioxide treatment, obviously you're going to be using carbon dioxide. We will accept carbon dioxide applied to the enclosure either in liquid, so cylinderized or in bulk, or from dry ice. You cannot use a CO2 burner to produce carbon dioxide. We won't accept that for these treatments. We'll only accept the cylinderized or the bulk or the dry ice carbon dioxide. Important to note, when you're using carbon dioxide, because of the low temperature, sorry, the boiling point of carbon dioxide, a vaporizer must be used when it's being applied to the enclosure, and that just makes sure that you can continue to apply the gas in a consistent manner. Where you're conducting a low oxygen treatment, you must use nitrogen gas to remove the oxygen from the enclosure. And again, this can either be liquid, so cylinderized or bulk, or extracted from the atmosphere using a nitrogen generator. Again, a burner can't be used to burn oxygen or remove oxygen from the enclosure. Neither can chemical reactions, so the use of iron oxide or something, or iron to remove oxygen from the enclosure is also not allowed. So for our low oxygen treatments, either use liquid nitrogen or use the nitrogen generator. Thanks, Charlotte. Now, one of the really important things with these treatments is because we're looking to treat the goods, and it's what we're trying to manage is the risk of Capra beetle being inside the goods. We have some requirements around consignment suitability, and it's effectively around the packaging that's used in the transport of these goods. So during the treatment, the goods must be free from impermeable material, or if there is impermeable material being used, that wrapping needs to be opened or slashed prior to treatment. But the easiest way to conduct these treatments will be to ensure that the goods are treated prior to being packaged. Obviously, with commercial packaging, some of those are likely to be impervious to the controlled atmosphere that we're trying to get in, or at least slow down the gas exchange for the controlled atmosphere and whatever atmosphere is within the packaging. So that's not acceptable. So the easiest way to conduct these treatments will be to do the treatment prior to packaging. And again, this is likely to require the treatment provider to work with the rest of the supply chain to identify sort of the right time to conduct these treatments. And again, as you will have seen from one of those earlier slides, the treatment must be conducted within 21 days of export. So the treatment needs to be finished within 21 days of export. That really means with this requirement, it's going to be some work between the treatment provider and the exporter and the rest of the supply chain to make sure that the treatment can be conducted, the goods packaged and sent for export within 21 days. And that's all to manage the risk of reinfestation of the goods. You'll see down the bottom there, if you are using impervious packaging or wrapping, we have some requirements around perforation standards that will ensure that adequate gas exchange. Thanks, Charlotte. So importantly, go back on there. Importantly, for any treatment, we need to verify that the treatment's being conducted effectively. And for controlled atmosphere treatments, that means monitoring the concentration of the gases inside the enclosure. Like I said before, Australia's treatment requirements are slightly unique, because we're going to require that the gas concentrations that are achieved at the start are maintained throughout the exposure period. And the only way we're going to know that that has happened is if we monitor the gas concentrations throughout the exposure period. So importantly, all enclosures must have at least 3 concentration monitoring locations. And these monitoring locations can either be measured with concentration sampling tubes, so running a tube from within the enclosure to the outside and drawing a sample through a monitoring device, or for some treatments it might be more practical to use a device that is placed within the enclosure itself to take monitoring readings. Either option is acceptable. You just need to make sure that the locations being monitored the following that we're about to discuss. So 2 of those locations must be as close as practical. So one of them needs to be in the outlet of the enclosure. So obviously with these controlled atmosphere treatments, when you're adding gas to the enclosure, the gas needs to come out of the enclosure from somewhere else. So wherever that outlet is, that's a location that needs, the concentration there needs to be monitored. The second location needs to be within any packaging surrounding the goods in the centre of the enclosure. So right in the middle of the enclosure and within any packaging being used. So again, as I said in the last slide, these treatments are going to be easiest to conduct prior to any packaging being used. But if packaging has been applied, whether that's bulk bags or any sort of packaging, the concentration must be monitored from within that packaging. And that's just to make sure that the packaging's allowing the controlled atmosphere to get in, and we're not creating a sort of a bubble where a Capra beetle would be able to survive. The final location depends on the type of enclosure that you're using. So a chamber or an unsheeted enclosure, you need to have the final monitoring point within 10 centimetres of the door seals. And this is just because the door seals are likely to be a point where you get some leakage. So we just want to make sure that any leakage that's coming in through the door seals isn't making the treatment ineffective. For a sheeted enclosure or a cocoon, the monitoring line needs to be as close as, the monitoring point, whether you're using a monitoring line or a standalone device, needs to be as close as practical to the sheet at the top of the enclosure. And we really want to make sure that we're as close as possible to the sheet to try and make sure we're monitoring to see whether there's any gas permeating through the sheets being used to set up that treatment enclosure. So those 3 monitoring lines or monitoring locations are the minimum requirements. You'll need to conduct additional gas monitoring if there are multiple targets of treatment or where there are multiple containers being treated under a sheet. So if you're treating more than one commodity and it's in more than one type of packaging, you'll need to use multiple monitoring points. So at least one example of each type of packaging needs to be used. And where you've got multiple containers in a single sheeted enclosure, you'll need to monitor each container as well. It's really important to note the monitoring that happens within the packaging. The way that you insert either the monitoring line or the device within the packaging needs to be done in such a way that you're not, that packaging needs to remain representative of the rest of the sample. So it's no good just to open the packaging and put a monitoring line in there because that will of course change it, and the hole that you put in there to put the monitoring line in will allow the controlled atmosphere to go through. It's not representative of the actual packaging being used. So we need to make sure that we're sealing up behind the monitoring line whenever we're inserting it into packaging. Again, it's going to be easiest to conduct these treatments prior to any packaging being used. Thanks, Charlotte. And again, importantly, the other thing that we need to monitor is the temperature. So I said at the start, it's really important to monitor the temperature within the enclosure and within the goods. So it won't come as any surprise that we require a temperature monitoring device in the goods and one in the enclosure. And again, that temperature needs to be maintained within the enclosure throughout the treatment period. Thanks, Charlotte. So during the treatment, after you've placed your monitoring lines and you've placed your temperature sensors, we actually need to use those locations to monitor the gas concentration and the temperature. So importantly, the gas concentration and the temperature must be monitored from the start of the gas introduction. So again, I was talking about it before, for some larger enclosures, it can take 1 or 2 days of introducing gas prior to the exposure period being started. We want the monitoring to start from the very start of the gas being introduced so we can see how long it takes to achieve that exposure period. The monitoring must continue throughout the exposure period, at least every hour, right up until the end. And your exposure period only starts when all your gas concentrations meet or exceed the parameters of the treatment schedule. So for those low oxygen treatments, for example, that's when the oxygen in the enclosure gets below 1%, then your exposure period would start, ensuring that your temperature was above the required, both in the enclosure and the goods again. Importantly, all gas concentration monitoring readings and temperature readings must meet or exceed the requirements for the whole exposure period. Otherwise, the treatment is failed. So even if there's one monitoring point that goes below temperature or outside of the gas concentration, then unfortunately the treatment has failed and will need to be reconducted. And that's why it's really important to ensure that some preparation goes into conducting these treatments to make sure that they're given their best chance of being effective. So we want to do those pressure tests to make sure that we've got some level of confidence that we can maintain the gas. But even with a pressure test, you're still going to want to monitor and probably top up the gas throughout the treatment period. And for temperature treatments, you're going to want to make sure you have pretty tight control over the temperature of the goods and the enclosure. Thanks, Charlotte. So really important to get the certification and the documents right for these treatments. So all treatment information must be recorded on a record of treatment, and that record of treatment must be conducted on site as the tasks are performed. All gas dosing information, the concentration readings and the temperature readings must be included as an attachment to the record of treatment. And I'll go through the record of treatment in a bit more detail in a sec. In addition, a treatment certificate must be issued by the treatment provider once they are satisfied treatment has been performed in accordance with our requirements. All sections of that treatment certificate are mandatory and need to be filled out correctly. Any mistakes or incorrect or incomplete certificates can create delays at the border and it may result in the goods being exported, which obviously isn't ideal. So the easiest way to make sure that your treatment documentation is compliant with Australia's requirements is to use the templates that we provide. So as part of developing that controlled atmosphere methodology, we've pulled together a record of treatment and a treatment certificate template, and I'd encourage everyone to use those templates. And Charlotte, flick through to the next slide. I'll show you a quick look at what those templates look like. So that's the treatment certificate on the left there, the record of treatment on the right. And if you go through to the next slide for me there, Charlotte, we'll just have a closer look at the record of treatment. So you will have seen from the previous slide, this is all on one page. I've just split it in two to make it a little bit bigger on this slide here. For those that are familiar with our methyl bromide or our heat treatment records, this looks slightly familiar. So we're looking for information on the job details, the enclosure details. That should all be reasonably self-explanatory. The next section there on the left is for pressure testing. Again, if you're using a chamber, that is once every 6 months, and all we'll need is the date of the last test, and there will be separate records kept for that chamber. All other enclosures, we want the results of the pressure testing included on this record of treatment. So if you're going to use a sheeted or unsheeted enclosure, we need to see that pressure test conducted. The next step there on the right is to look at the treatment details. So obviously you need to tell us whether you're trying to do a high carbon dioxide treatment or a low oxygen treatment. You need to tell us what parameters you're trying to meet and then what you've actually achieved. On the right, you'll need to tell us your initial gas in details. So this is to get to your start point. You need to tell us what gas you're using, whether it's carbon dioxide or nitrogen. And then again, as I mentioned before, you need to include all additional gas applied as an attachment to this record. So it's likely for these treatments, because they go for so many days, that you're going to need to top up with additional gas. All of those details need to be captured and included as an attachment. We then have our concentration readings. And again, for those familiar with methyl bromide, this will look similar. We have space here for the the readings that we use to establish the start of the exposure period. So that should show the readings all above the required concentration or below for oxygen. And then the endpoint, so at the end of that exposure period, what it was. But then all of the gas and temperature monitoring readings that were taken in between those 2 points will also need to be included as an attachment, and all of this will need to be kept together. And then we'll also look for some details there on the ventilation. So get you to flick through to the next slide there for us, Charlotte. So just to summarise our requirements, and one thing I've just noticed with that presentation, and Charlotte touched on it, is where you're conducting these treatments. So you'll need an import permit, you'll need a treatment certificate, but you also need a phytosanitary certificate. So after these treatments have been conducted, they're required to be inspected by the relevant government authority in the country of export, and that government is required to issue a phytosanitary certificate to ensure that the goods are free from capra beetle as well. And there are some details on that, on the requirements for the phytosanitary certificate on our website. But in summary, if you're going to use our controlled atmosphere treatments, recognise that this is a new treatment for most of the people on the line here, and particularly a new treatment for Australia. So if anyone is looking to conduct these treatments, the department is really interested in working with you to make sure that those treatments are conducted effectively and that everything complies with our requirements. So I'd encourage anyone that's considering to either conduct these treatments or use them for import to contact the department. Let us know what you're planning so we can provide any feedback and answer any questions that you've got. You can also find more information on our website there on the left. That QR code will take you to a video which will explain a little bit more about Capra beetle. I'd encourage everyone to register to receive BICON alerts, which will let everyone know any changes to these import requirements. Otherwise, you can contact us again using that email address on the right. And finally, I'd just like to again mention that controlled atmosphere methodology, where all of the requirements that I've just gone through is out for consultation at the moment. So I'd encourage everyone to have a look at that document, provide their comments to us by the end of the week, and we'll be looking to publish a final version of that document as soon as we can work through those comments. I'll now pass back over to Jamie and we can run through some questions and answers.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you very much for going through that. It's so detailed. It is a new treatment for Australia, and you went through that very well, Sam, and I know we've got some questions already. Before we get to the questions, I'd just like to quickly run through what our three speakers went through. So we heard from Nathan first up, and he told us about how Capra beetle is Australia's most or second most unwanted pest. It's actually the grains industry most unwanted pest. It could cost us up to $15.5 billion as an economy over 20 years. And because Capra is different, it's a different pest, it's requiring these very specific methodologies or treatments where we're putting on the commodities and also containers. And so Capra is cryptic, it hides, it goes into a resting phase or a diapause phase, and it's got this classic avoidance behaviour. So what we're talking about mainly in the phase 3 is more about products, but we do include responses to containers. So it's mainly about products. Charlotte, when you heard from Charlotte, she was speaking about there are some exclusions to some of the treatments. She encouraged you to go to BICON and to look at that imports conditions website. She spoke about the different circumstances under which each of those, the heat, the methyl bromide we spoke about yesterday, and the controlled atmosphere today, where they can be used. Sam went into that detail and spoke all about the way controlled atmosphere is an alternative. Some people do use the term modified atmosphere, but we're going to use the term controlled atmosphere. And he did emphasise about BICON. He spoke about the different ways carbon dioxide can be applied under high pressure or atmospheric pressure, and about how low oxygen can be used. He went through that methodology document, the controlled atmosphere methodology document, which will take you through the detail that he's gone through today. He also spoke about the enclosures. He spoke about the needing to monitor for temperature and also concentration of the controlled atmosphere gases, and spoke about treatment certification, so about that record of treatment and about the treatment certificate. And most importantly, it's about working with you, our stakeholders. You know, we've invited you here today. You've come along today to engage with us, which we're very grateful for. And it's by presenting this information and then answering your questions coming up now, how we can best serve that information to you. So let's go to our first question. And as I roll through here, we've had Steve's included there a link to the Capra beetle Urgent Actions website that's been mentioned a lot today. There's a lot of detail in that website, so please go to that. Second question here is from Anonymous, so someone who we don't know their name, so sorry we can't direct that to you, but they import organic food, and as per the website, it says a permit is not required. And then the question is, do we still need to obtain an import permit? If yes, do we need to obtain the permit for exclusion list as well? So Sam, can I direct that one to you?
Yeah, certainly. So if you can find on our website where it says you don't need an import permit to use the controlled atmosphere treatment, please let us know, because I'm looking at one part where it definitely has it listed there that you need to get an import permit if you want to use controlled atmosphere treatments, and I'll put a link to that in the chat in just a moment. So yes, if you want to use controlled atmosphere treatments to manage your organic product, then you will need an import permit. If your goods meet the exclusion list, then you will not need an import permit. So as Charlotte touched on in her presentation, there are some goods that are excluded from the high risk plant products list. To demonstrate that your goods are excluded from these measures, you just need to provide some form of commercial documentation that has a description that clearly states how these goods are excluded from the measures. It's also important to note that some of those exclusions will only exclude you from the treatment requirement. You may still be required to obtain a phytosanitary certificate. So I'd encourage everyone to look at that list of high risk plant products as well.
Thanks, Sam. Good answer too. Our next question is from Savin. So welcome back again, Savin. It's like I said yesterday, it's nice to see these familiar names. So steam sterilisation process can be considered for control of capra beetle in organic agri products where methyl bromide or heat treatment is not recommended. And then Savin says the steam sterilisation process has capability to kill all stages of capra beetle and other stored pests, as the material it passes through is at 110 degrees to 120 degrees Celsius for 8 to 10 minutes. So back to you, Sam. I think that's something which they've obviously found and can use in certain situations, but does this apply for Australia's effect on capra beetle?
So to sort of explain our process, and I touched on it at the start. So in the development of our capra beetle measures, the department looked at the scientific literature, conducted a risk assessment and determined what treatments were going to be effective on capra beetle. The first two treatments that we determined were going to be effective were methyl bromide and heat. We understand that those options are not available in all circumstances. So we've started looking at alternative treatments based on advice from industry, so the organics industry here in Australia and some others. The first treatment that we've looked at has been using what we're calling now controlled atmospheres or modified atmospheres. So that's the first alternative option that we're looking at. If people have suggestions for other alternative treatments that they would like the department to consider, whether it's steam or any other type of treatment, get in contact with the department, point us in the direction of some literature, some peer-reviewed research that shows that the proposed option is effective against capra beetle and importantly against the diapausing larval stage of capra beetle, which is the most difficult life stage to manage. And we'll be more than happy to consider any other alternative treatments as well. So I'd encourage Savin to get in contact with the department with a bit more information about the treatment that he's proposing and some of the efficacy data that sits behind that treatment. And we're more than happy to accept anything that's going to work to manage the risk of capra beetle.
Thanks, Sam. Excellent answer again. So that risk assessment, it is an important step. And we do encourage people to provide their background as to why they think their particular method they're putting forward could work. And that can be looked at by the department. That's good, Sam. Thank you for that. Another question from Mikhail is, for treatment of bulk goods, can vacuumised packaging also be accepted as an enclosure? as long as the parameters inside the bag meet requirements. So it could be carbon dioxide content or low oxygen content. So it's about bulk treatments and vacuumised packaging.
So importantly, at this stage, the department, as part of the alternative treatments that we've looked at, we've not looked at the packaging. So where a modified atmosphere is applied as part of the packaging. This is why we've deliberately called our treatment option here controlled atmospheres, because what we want to do is initially modify the atmosphere in an enclosure and then control it throughout the entire exposure period. And part of that control includes monitoring and verifying that the gas has remained at the concentrations that we need it to. So at this stage, we haven't looked at the packaging. So modified atmospheres applied as part of packaging because you can't, or at this stage, we haven't found a way that people have been verifying that the concentration remains effective throughout the whole packaging and transport process, or throughout what would be the required exposure period. But again, if anyone has any details on that, we'd be more than happy to consider it. But at this point, it's not being considered as part of Australia's acceptable treatment options.
Thanks, Sam. And another good one on risk assessment. Alex is asking a question, and I think this is going to be more attuned to the sensitivity of this indicator, but it's can oxygen indicator tablets be used to show low oxygen inside a bag or an enclosure? And I guess that's instead of having an electronic monitor, Sam.
So without knowing the specifics of the tablets that you're talking about, you're exactly right, Jamie. There's a sensitivity, or there's a few issues with this sort of measure. The sensitivity is one. Your ability during the treatment process to get feedback on the concentration level in the enclosure. As I said before, particularly with those low oxygen treatments, one of the options is 22 days and one of the options is 12 days. It's very likely, particularly with nitrogen treatments, that you're going to need to top up during the treatment. It's difficult if you use those tablets to keep an accurate record of what the gas is in that enclosure to help inform you whether or not you've topped up. At this stage, what I'd say the best option, Alex, is to again contact the department. If you're planning on using that as part of your setup, contact the department, tell us exactly what you're planning on using and the specifications of your tablets, and we can have a bit of a conversation with you as to whether or not that's going to comply with our requirements and get you an effective treatment. And that really goes for anyone with questions about what equipment can be used, what setup should I use. As I mentioned before, the department's really really interested to make sure that people are complying with our requirements. Happy to have people contact us, and we'll more than happily provide feedback and help point people in the direction of compliance.
Thank you, Sam. And apologies in advance for some of my pronunciations of your names, but we've got a comment here from Simoni Chatagorgio from Greece, and they're from Agro Speccom. They're using 3 low oxygen controlled atmosphere chambers in Greece. They perform treatments to organic products using various protocols according to insect to extinguish the product. They are equipped with a nitrogen generator, a compressor, sensors, measuring temperature and oxygen. They are airtight. So thank you. I'll register the company's interest in conducting controlled atmosphere treatments. They've been using them successfully, the method for more than 10 years, with all the necessary recordings. So that's temperature and oxygen. So good comment from Simoni. Do you want to have a word on that one, Sam?
No, but it sounds like you've got a lot of experience, and we're happily we'll wait for your email and more than happy to have a bit of a conversation about what our requirements are. I will just note, it has been pointed out to me that I might have misinterpreted Michael's question earlier when he said for treatment of bulk goods, can vacuumised packaging be accepted as an enclosure? I took the question to mean the packaging around the goods individually, so like the commercial packaging and applying modified atmosphere as part of that packaging. that then goes to the customer. And in that case, like I said before, we haven't considered that, and at this stage it's not acceptable. But Michael may have actually been talking about using like a cocoon, what industry sometimes refer to as a cocoon type enclosure around the bulk bags for the bulk commodity. And yes, so long as the concentration and the temperature within that enclosure can be monitored and it can meet the requirements, then yes, those sort of bulk bag using cocoons and that sort of stuff can be used as a treatment option, or used as an enclosure, sorry. Just as I said before, the most important thing is making sure that you can monitor and maintain the concentration throughout the enclosure. So if you can do that as part of the bulk treatment, then that's okay.
Thank you, Sam. Sam's also put into the chat, people, about the information on the import permit included in this section of the website. So that's the link there that Sam's put in. Okay, another question from Anonymous is, what if we do not find any treatment provider overseas? How can they still export products?
Yeah, so this comes back to what Nathan was talking about at the start of our presentation here. So Capra beetle is, as we've mentioned a couple of times, Australia's second most wanted pest, or most pest of significant concern, and it's number one priority pest for grain products. It's a really nasty one that we're desperate to keep out. At the moment, you know, when we've looked at the risk of having these goods come to Australia, the risk of Capra beetle establishing is unacceptable. So at the moment, we're not allowing onshore treatment. So at this stage, the goods must be treated offshore prior to arrival in Australia. So if you can't find an offshore treatment provider, I'd encourage you to get in contact with the department. And again, this is why I'd encourage all the treatment providers to get in contact with the department and register their interest, because if we find treatment providers that are available in countries, we can put them in touch with people that are looking for treatment providers in particular countries. Your other options are sort of to have the goods transshipped to another country where the treatment can be conducted prior to arrival in Australia. But yeah, unfortunately at this stage, the risk is too great to Australia, so it must be treated prior to arrival.
Thank you, Sam. We've got a combination treatment here put forward by pn@organicfumigation.com, controlled atmosphere. As the Capra beetle is sensitive to high temperature, is there an option for shorter temperature time with higher temperature and or lower oxygen concentration? They've been conducting some treatments, which they say have been less than 5 days for all the beetles counted. So a combination question, similar feedback on risk assessment, I guess, to what we've spoken about before.
Yeah, again, the department is open to considering any options that have efficacy data to support them. So I'd encourage you to contact the department with your option. And as I sort of mentioned previously, if you can provide a link to published research specifically for Capra beetle and specifically for diapausing larvae and the efficacy of the treatment against those particular life stages of this pest, then yeah, we would 100% accept that as a valid option if the efficacy data and the science is behind it. And again, we'd encourage anyone, if that research hasn't been conducted at the moment and people have the capacity or the interest in developing more alternative treatments, please let the department know, and we're more than happy to have a look at this stuff.
Thank you, Sam. Next question is from Rajita Cook from Sri Lanka. So welcome, Sri Lanka. That's really nice to have you on board. And they're asking the question, what's the difference between controlled atmosphere treatment options number 2? So that's carbon dioxide at 80% at normal atmospheric pressure, and option 3, which is low oxygen plus nitrogen, because they're both measurements, both treatments that measure low oxygen. Is there a particular difference you want to clarify with those two options, Sam?
Yeah, so they are actually slightly different, and the mechanism that they use to manage the pest is slightly different. So for our high carbon dioxide treatment, the mode of action to kill the pest is, well, it's probably a combination of things, but it's most likely to be the poisoning effect from the high carbon dioxide. And for those that are looking for the technical term for that, that's hypercarbia. The low oxygen treatments are relying on removing the oxygen from the environment, and basically the insect asphyxiates in the same way that like any other oxygen breathing organism would struggle without oxygen in the enclosure. So they are slightly different. For the carbon dioxide treatment, we're requiring that the carbon dioxide is measured during the exposure period. For the low oxygen treatments, we're looking to measure the oxygen content. I think it's important to note the reason why we're offering these different options is to provide as many options and as much flexibility as we can to industry and how they'd like to meet these requirements to trade with Australia. And again, I think this just reiterates Australia's commitment to working with industry to try and find some practical examples. For some people, the high carbon dioxide treatments are going to be the easiest, the cheapest, most affordable ones to conduct. For some people, it's going to be the low oxygen treatments that work better for their supply chain and the infrastructure that they've got. So we're just providing the option for flexibility.
Thanks, Sam. And look, thank you for clarifying that different mode of action or the different mechanisms in how both those two treatments work. Yes, it is all about increasing options for people to use as alternative treatments. Got a question here from another anonymous. Currently, we are having treatment chambers out of which few are at 20.5 bar, which are hydro tested for pressure of 25 bar maximum capacity, and a few are maximum capacity 16.5 bar. So since 2017, they've been doing treatments at 15 bar for 10 hours, and they have been successfully achieving elimination of capra beetle and never encountered an issue, and regularly exporting to various countries, and no buyer has reported us with any non-compliance related to capra beetle. Would you please consider modified atmospheric treatment or controlled atmospheric treatment with more than 95% carbon dioxide at 15 bar exposure for 10 hours at ambient temperature? So again, Sam, another slight alteration, and I guess back to that risk assessment that you've been conducting before. If they've got data to support that, that'd be good.
Yeah, and importantly, what we want there is peer-reviewed, independent scientific data. The department works on scientific evidence. I think the absence of issues is not necessarily the same as peer-reviewed research. So if you are conducting those treatments and you've got the facilities, by all means, reach out to us and we can talk to you about how you can go about conducting some of that research to have a look to see whether it sort of meets our requirements. But in general, yeah, we want peer-reviewed scientific research. But I'd still encourage you to reach out to the department with information on your setup, and we can have a bit of a conversation about your specific equipment and see if there's not more information we can find out.
Thanks, Sam. And again, we're actually getting right into that territory with this next question. Again, anonymous, would you please entertain or consider individual video calls or maybe just phone calls from an exporter so they can share their experience and issues with the Australian officers like yourselves? And again, that offshore treatments at awe.gov.au email is probably the best way to contact you, Sam.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, encourage people, if you want to have a chat to us, reach out through email and we're more than happy to have a conversation. Thanks,
Sam. And now we've got a very specific question regarding some of those details you went through previously. So from Anonymous, please clarify whether the pressure test procedure for holding pressure of 200 pascals to 100 pascals for more than 10 seconds is also required to be conducted for pressure chambers where treatment will be conducted where treatment will be conducted at 20 bar. You're aware that these treatment pressure chambers are already tested for their quality and fitness by the third-party inspection agency approved by Government of India. We've already got our vessels for which we are treating with 20 bar, tested at 25 bar per 25 kilograms per centimetre squared for 10 minutes, and these are tested by an approved and recognised agency. So quite a specific question.
Yeah, and again, I'll reiterate that those high pressure treatments, so the ones using either 30 bar or 20 bar, those treatments are not subject to our methodology. They're managed separately, and what we want to do is through the import permit process, understand your specific setup more readily. If you're already doing pressure testing that's over and above what we require, that's good news. We just need to find out a little bit more information about your setup before we approve the import permit. But again, so the requirements that I went through for pressure testing apply to chambers and enclosures that are being used for normal atmospheric pressures. So the high pressure ones are not subject to our methodology. We'd just like to know a little bit more about your setup to make sure that it is, a commercially available system and that it works for the treatment that we're talking about. For everyone else that wants to use normal atmospheric pressure treatments, I'd encourage you to have a look at the pressure testing section in our methodology, the consultation draft. Have a look at the requirements in there, and it sort of explains what the process is.
Thanks, Sam. And it's just been pointed out, this is all from the same person, these questions. So there's one more to go in this series of 4. So clarification is required if the ambient temperature of container and commodity, rice, is lower than 20 degrees Celsius. Then what's the option? Because rice will not tolerate additional heat for raising the temperature, because the additional heat will affect quality of organic, it'll crack, of the rice, it'll crack, and ultimately lead to cooking quality issues, and the aroma will be lost, and consumers will not prefer to eat that basmati rice. So it's about temperature and ambient temperature of rice when it's lower than 20 degrees Celsius.
So, I mean, I'd need more information about that 20 degree sort of requirement. The information that we have is that 20 degrees wouldn't seem to cause much of an issue for a commodity like rice. I mean, you've kind of got to imagine that, these goods are likely to be stored in places and they're grown in places that are over 20 degrees. And when they're sitting in the supermarket here in Australia, they're likely to experience temperatures over 20 degrees as well. But noting that, if you do have concerns about the damage to your commodity, I'd have a look at alternative treatment options. So again, we've got methyl bromide available. If you've got another alternative that you'd like considered, please send it through to the department and we'll have a look.
Thanks, Sam. Ashay is asking, are there any provisional options available once the goods arrived in Australia? So that's about onshore treatment, and I know we've covered that before, Sam.
So yeah, no onshore treatment is available for these goods. So yeah, really important to make sure that we understand what these requirements are, that we're applying these treatments effectively overseas, because yeah, unfortunately where goods arrive in Australia, and I want to stress each consignment will be assessed on an individual basis, but it's most likely that the risk of the goods will not be able to be managed here in Australia if they're at risk of holding capra beetle, and so most likely they'll be directed for export. But again, I want to stress each consignment gets assessed on an individual basis, but realistically there's no options for managing the goods here in Australia, or no widespread options for managing the goods here in Australia.
Thanks, Sam. And I'll just jump a question and just note that